Just before the episode gets underway, I'd like to let you know that it's exactly 5 years now since the Reimagining Cyber podcast began, back in December 2020. There have been many changes in the cybersecurity landscape since then. What hasn't wavered is the support we've had from you, our loyal audience. So thanks for subscribing and following the podcast. And if you don't already, you know what to do. Now on with the show. Hello and welcome to Reimagining Cyber. I'm Rob Aragao, and today we are going to be unpacking one of the biggest shifts happening in our industry. The fact that AI systems are becoming more autonomous, regulations are catching up fast, and companies are suddenly starting to realize that they're not prepared. With me to break this down today is Ken Johnston, the VP of Data, Analytics, and AI at Envorso. Ken brings more than 30 years of experience in data, AI, cloud systems, and software from his time at Microsoft, Ford, and Autonomic.ai. At Envorso, he helps companies build scalable, trustworthy AI platforms, and he's on the front lines of the compliance wave that's about to hit us all. Hey, Ken, there's a lot going on around AI, of course, but there's also a lot of legislation, regulatory views and perspectives and frameworks that have been launched over time. Colorado, obviously, has got a law going into effect here in 2026. The EU continues to tighten its own rules, and they were really one of the first ones, obviously, to come forward with their own kind of, again, framework. Just one of the things that's interesting to me, and I'm sure the audience is, why do you think it's taken companies just so long to get their arms wrapped around AI from a compliance perspective?
Well, I really think of it in two ways, and that's, by the way, a really good question. Two ways. One, some of the early regulations, they had no teeth. And you mentioned the EU AI Act and Colorado, both of which start to have financial impact in 26. And so that's one of the reasons why I emphasize that there's so much that's going to change in terms of governance. I liken it to when GDPR passed for privacy. There's finally laws that have teeth. With the EU AI Act, 7% of global revenue, that's going to get a lot of attention. Companies are not going to want to take risks with that. The other thing is that, honestly, companies just don't understand AI, and they're scrambling to understand it, and trying to deal with regulation that has no teeth is low on the priority list. You've seen a lot of the reports that say 85 to 95% of AI projects are failing to add value. Everybody's trying to understand it. So sort of like we saw with privacy, compliance is low on the list. People are just scrambling to understand. So I think those two are really the key that's impacting the slow attention to best practice standards. And again, there's nothing like a SOC 2 compliance for AI today. They're going to be happening in the near future, but it's just not there. So we're at the tipping point, and that's really what 26 is going to be, a tipping point where governance moves to the forefront and companies are going to pay significant attention.
I think that's a great point. And I think your correlation back to 2018 with GDPR getting launched, having the teeth behind it, right? Obviously that makes a difference, but it's also the perspective you just painted out, which is we're still in the infancy stages of getting our arms wrapped around AI, putting in these guardrails that organizations are trying to accomplish and figure out while they're still learning all along the way. But yeah, once you put some financial penalties in place, that kind of changes everything, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Sure, for sure. No, so build upon that, right? So if you think about teams within the organizations today and translating these new laws and the effectiveness and maybe control mechanisms they now have to put in place, like what's the perspective, right? What do you think they should be taking into consideration? Some steps maybe they should start taking literally right now.
So steps companies should be taking right now, I actually liken it to DevSecOps and the debt we saw companies build up when they weren't paying attention to security and they were launching products and finding security vulnerabilities late. What you're building up right now with AI governance is what I call governance debt. It's another kind of technical debt, just like we see everywhere in software, whether it's security related or not. And so by ignoring these risk areas like data provenance or bias or other things like that in your system, not implementing observability correctly and audit logging and things like that, you're building up bias. So I really liken it to implementing and getting your arms around the fundamentals of proper DevOps practices, but applying it to governance. What are those things that you need to put into your pipelines? Your developers are being gold on shipping code. Your lawyers are being gold on
Right.
reducing risk, and neither of them speaks the same language and they're not on the same page. So you're building up a lot of debt. So get prepared to deal with that. That's what I would say. Focus in on getting ready to get your fundamentals in place right away because you're going to have a lot of debt to clean up or you're going to start seeing these fines hit you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too, is just the hygiene, right? And building that foundational layer of consistency. You just said something which is exactly, spot on. The DevSecOps kind of, I'd say, evolution, the technology audience, whether they're in development, whether they're in security, whether they're in operations, even in those frames have their own language. Never mind what you just talked about, which is now you hop over to the legal and compliance side, and it's a whole different vocabulary that happens there. So to me, as you just frame that, it's an opportunity for us to really try to get ahead of it and have the same vernacular pretty well defined, at least within our own organizations, as again, it is early, but the debt is mounting quickly, let's just say. So being able to get some of that vernacular is, I think, an opportunity that people probably would be, very smart to begin with as a first step in essence. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, that's 100%. I glommed onto DevOps and DevSecOps a year or two ago and just looking at how those evolved and data governance as well, and realized the parallels with what are going on in AI governance. And, I just call it AI GovOps. It's really how do you bring agility to governance? One of the things I hated as a developer, and if I go back, sorry, early days of security, I saw it as a tax. I'm like, oh my gosh, why do I have to do my security audit review? Oh my gosh, this is so much paperwork. But that's developer mindset. If you give us tools and technology, sure, we'll implement them, but make us do a bunch of paperwork. And that's the challenge we have right now. And that's the mindset we're trying to help developers understand. But we have to get the ecosystem involved in creating the technology and tools to automate it. And that's when I talk about the debt crisis in governance. It's that lack of technology. You have policymakers and researchers running out ahead, but you now need the software ecosystem, just like we have with security, building up to really automate this. And that's what I find exciting is thinking about that, because there are a lot of tools. There's a lot of open source tools. There's a lot of tools in research, but how do we apply them and get them involved at scale quickly? And that's one of the areas I love focusing on. It's a differentiator for me now that I'm in consulting versus, big tech like I used to be at Microsoft. I'm like, hey, what's the gap in the enterprise now that I talk to a lot of CIOs and stuff? And I'm like, lack of automation. Pretty simple.
And it's interesting too, that perspective of, again, development. It's all about, okay, what project do I have in front of me? And how quickly can I get this done and out the door, right? Am I doing that to maybe add new features and capability to an existing solution? Or am I actually launching a brand new solution that we're bringing to market to help drive revenue quickly? And then security comes in with all these different checkpoints and questions, and they're just slowing me down. But it's that opportunity, again, of getting up in front so that you can actually continue to be very efficient through that process. By the way, also reducing the risk thereafter once it's out the door.
Yep. It's 100% the same thing. If you understand the importance of continuous delivery, if you understand the importance of minimum viable product, you can't have governance get in the way of that momentum, and governance isn't connected to how security has now become connected to it. And that is, it's security and governance and privacy, they're all interrelated. They're all important in the same approaches. So you can't, if you're going to be successful as a company, you still have to have speed and momentum with your CI/CD. You still have to have that, but how do you build that up and maintain governance?
Yeah, completely. So let's take it a little bit further. You kind of started talking about this a little earlier, which is, we just look at it from this way, the data issue, the bias issue. How do you kind of look at these, where are you seeing some of the most common concerns around that put these companies at risk?
So one of the things I often talk about when I talk to companies about because AI builds off of data. You and I know that. It's like data is the fuel for AI. And I often start talking to them about, bias in, bias out. The real world has bias in it. And so you have to understand you can't just train on the real world. One of the great opportunities with AI is to actually adjust, recognize, and tune some of that innate cultural bias out. One example that burned Apple was a few years ago. They launched their Apple credit card. And they didn't use gender as a feature in it, but it was quickly discovered within days of the credit card launching that it had a bias for credit limits against women in the model. Apple denied any possibility that it was there because they hadn't used gender. However, the company that helped them build it used shopping history as one of the features. And did you know that women buy things differently than men? And did you know that historically in our credit history in the US and America, that women that make the same income and have the same credit score as a man tend to get lower credit limits? Imagine that the AI managed to learn that. And so not watching for the bias, accepting that the real world can be fair and applying that data is one of the fundamental flaws. You have to recognize the data has a bias embedded in it. How do you prepare for it? And again, what we talk a lot in data provenance is recognizing that there's also inferred attributes in the data. So you can't just say, oh, we don't have gender or we don't have race. There's massive studies that show correlation with geolocation. Zip code is an indicator of race. And so you can't just use this data and say, oh, I didn't use ethnicity as a feature. The AI figures it out. So bias exists in the world. How do you prepare for it? And to make a better world, how do we make AI that avoids that? So that's one of the key things I look at is, just talking about that. And then the second thing is ongoing monitoring in your pipelines over time. You will have data drift. Bias will creep in. There are many cases, if you wanted to, we can talk about data poisoning that's happening in models today because people are finding opportunities to nudge AI and create lawsuits and things like that. So you don't have to just do it to make the world better. You also have to do it as a defensive posture because you will be attacked.
Yeah, that whole kind of inherited bias that you just discussed, really interesting perspective. I've heard of those things in the past in certain situations, but you just framed up really nicely as an example, especially with the Apple credit card launch. And it's really interesting to think, how do you really kind of peel some of those inherent bias elements out? And it'll be interesting to see how people do so. Now, one of the things that would be good for the audience to hear, I think it's always great, especially someone, that's really focused in this area, such as yourself, simple things, right? So what are the simple kind of guardrails that they should be considering now, especially as it comes around agentic AI systems?
All right. Agentic AI. Well, I'm going to start with two things first, which is audits and observability. Everybody's leaving that out of their AI. So make sure you don't ship your AI without that. And another thing that's really fallen on the wayside that I want to hit first, which is versioning your data and versioning your models. Because so much of AI is coming out of data scientists and PhDs, it's not always developers. You've lost some of those fundamentals of versioning. So that aside, let's jump into agentic. One of the top things you need to remember about agentic is it's high risk because you're giving an ability for AI to make decisions and take action. And so one of the things we talk a lot about is limiting. Put limits and thresholds on your AI. The other thing is to create an allowed list for what your AI can do, not a can't do list. Think about it from a security perspective. It's the same thing as with security. You're plugging holes, it's a leaky dike. You need to think about what you allow, least privilege allowance, just like you do in security. We need to think about that in AI and what we allow the AI to do. Human in the loop and thresholds. There's an example where it was Air Canada. They had a chatbot and a customer had somebody die and they asked if Air Canada had a bereavement fare and the chatbot said, yes, go ahead and you can file later to get the discount. The person flew and they filed later and Air Canada said, we don't have that as a policy, but they had the log from the chatbot that said that they could do it. They went to court and Air Canada tried to claim that the agent was not an employee and so they weren't liable for it, but they lost the case. And so, you're responsible for what your agents say. If they had simply bound that chatbot to only answer what was tied to the FAQ, it would not have been able to create new policies. And so that's an example of sometimes a lot of limiting is like dollar threshold. Oh, it can only make a decision up to $500. There's also bounding it to the scope in which it can make decisions. And then last thing is, again, just like we see with AI or with other security systems, limiting the permissions. Too often people create agents with system level accounts or they use the security level of the developer, and that opens all sorts of holes. So you need to think about how do you create a security context that limits what the AI can do from a security perspective as well. Just the permissions. If it has access to a system, it's a risk. So those are three things to think about. There's more I could go into, but those are the top three I'd give you.
No, and they're good. And I mean, kind of at the core, the least privilege model and applying that is absolutely important. Let's circle back and kind of my final question for you, circling it back to where we started, which is 2026 is going to have some real teeth because this financial penalty is coming along the way. So put yourself in the shoes of some, different folks that are going to be listening to this as leaders within the organizations. What's that one thing, right? That one thing they should really be considering to focus their attention on come the new year. January. It's January 1st. Here I am, ready to go. I'm in Colorado as my corporate headquarters. Right? This thing's lighting up on me and I'm going to have all sorts of questions. I better be prepared. Like, what's that one thing I'm going to start with?
Build your AI inventory now. You've already got it all over the place and it's doing stuff. Build the inventory now. I liken this to when GDPR passed or was about to pass. I was one of the leading data scientists working on Microsoft data, Windows, Office, all sorts of data. And I had to sit down with lawyers for 6 months going over where all the data was that I had access to and the different places that it was being used because we had lost track of that and we had to get it under control. Companies have lost track of what AI models they have, where they're running little things, little models helping to do predictions for marketing forecasts. There's no inventory, and each one of those is a risk point. So I would say start with an inventory. This playbook we have seen before. It's GDPR, but it's AI governance, and it is tied to data, but now it's tied to models and a lack of understanding what systems are there. It could be as simple as starting with a spreadsheet, get an audit going, create a governance debt ledger, just like we did with privacy so that you understand. And that's where I would start. Once you understand what you have today, of course, you've got your roadmap for what you're making, but seriously, most companies have lost sight on what they have today. And that goes back to my first comment. All of that is governance debt. All of that is tech debt. All of that is something that you have to address quickly because you're not going to be able to say to Colorado, oh, but we shipped that 3 years ago. It's not our fault that it's got problems. So I would start with that one.
And it's a great one to start with. I think, just building that foundation off of, again, just the inventory, what you have out there right now tied into your AI environment. We learned these lessons as you called out, right? GDPR and other privacy, right? Frameworks, regulation that came out where we learned the hard way. The blueprint has been laid out. Take advantage of what we learned there, apply it here, because I think you're spot on that. How do you control what you don't even know is out there?
The tools and technology for solving it are going to be different, just like they are with security. But yeah, the playbook, the starting point is very, very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken, it's been a pleasure having you on. I do have to say, I feel for the 6 months you had to deal with the lawyers at Microsoft. As you noted that as an example, that must have been very painful, but here you are today. Thank you for your additional research knowledge that you're actually sharing with us all out here. We're right around the corner where there's really teeth behind what's coming our way. And the changes are, things we have to take into consideration now. Your analogy of tying it back into privacy and GDPR being a great example is a very, very solid way, one I've not thought of before on how to approach this, but it's extremely logical. It makes all the sense in the world as you're walking through it. And even that syncing it back to like the technical debt from a DevOps or DevSecOps perspective and that whole shift left mentality, like, well, why would we have to shift left when we can start left in this approach right now?
That's great. I'm going to use that line.
Take it. It's all yours. Pay me the royalties after. Ken, appreciate the time. We'll talk soon. Take care now.
You bet.